I talked about the Harmony paper, and we were in the process of looking at analyzing games from the perspective of cost curves and thinking about cost curves for designing games. We ended up looking at free-to-play games as a lot of this because free-to-play games are difficult to design in that it is basically a demo. I don't think of a free-to-play game as anything else other than that. You download the game for free, just like you would download a demo for free, and you get some opportunity to play the game with its intended balance. And if you want to continue playing the game past that, instead of seeing a wall where it says, purchase the game if you'd like to continue, you're welcome to continue. It just gets more and more annoying to continue because the game is not balanced for you unless you pay the money. Recognizing that ruins mobile games for a lot of people because you really just see it as a glorified demo that has a worse monetization scheme than most games that you would pay for once out there. And it makes it very challenging to want to, at least in my shoes, contribute to that kind of economy because, I don't know, I'm just not a fan of having a subscription to a game that is not as high quality as some of the games that are out there. But designing mobile games is obviously proven to be very monetizable and very profitable. So if you are considering designing a free-to-play game, it's worth thinking about that from this cost curve perspective. Some other guidelines for cost curves. A limited benefit is never negative. That's an interesting way to phrase it. But so a sword that does extra damage against dragons, even if you forget to put any dragons in the game in the first place, it is a limited benefit. So there's no way that there's a cost associated with it. It's just a matter of the extent to which you want to attempt to account for that benefit. What value do you want to assign to a limited benefit? If you give the player a choice between two effects, that will, in practice, have a value that is the ceiling of those two options for the condition the player is in. This is why cards, we call them modal cards in Magic the Gathering. Ones that when you play it can have one or the other kinds of effects, or one or the other or another, or pick two out of the following three options. You can pick the same option more than once. That kind of design plays up in terms of its overall power level, because the player is able to choose between which of these effects is better for me at the current time. And so that needs a special balance level, because if you design each of those options to be on par, it's basically saying you get to play the better of two cards that are in your hand. So when you draw that one card, it's like having two cards in your hand. Instead of being able to play one and then the other, it's just an XOR. You choose the better one to play when you choose to play the card. But one mode of that or the other mode of that may be better situationally. So you always need to think of it as taking the ceiling or rolling with advantage if you're a D&D player. It's a very similar idea when you're designing something that gives the player a choice. They're always going to choose the better of those two choices to the best of their knowledge and ability. So if one of those extra options is useless, it doesn't make the value of the choice worse. It just means that it shouldn't have been designed in the first place. No one's ever choosing that mode, but it never makes the card worse for the option to pick it. Of course, you want to design when you do have modal options like this, such that each option should be chosen at some point. That's what makes the decision interesting. But again, you don't want those to be balanced individually at the power level that you would expect, because then in general, the player will be at an advantage and it won't actually be balanced in practice because of a sample size concern. If there are several abilities, figure out values of things separately. So a game object may have multiple abilities initially. It can be difficult from a designer's perspective or from the designer's shoes to figure out the value that each of those abilities adds to the overall game object. So if I can play a card that can choose mode A or mode B, what is the value of the card with both of those modes on the card? That can be a very difficult question to answer. If you are unsure how to balance something, it is better to start out with something that is underpowered than something that is overpowered, because players don't use underpowered items. If you recognize that your game object isn't being used to the extent to which you had anticipated it being, you can always balance it to be more powerful, and then people will start to use that game object. So it won't affect the overall game balance, the meta strategy that becomes part of the game. Yes, you spent some design time on an object that's not being used, and then players might question, why are they adding these things to the game if they're not powerful enough to be used? On the other hand, though, if you design an overpowered item, it can completely destroy the balance of the game. And that looks really bad from a designer's perspective, because now you have to nerf an overpowered strategy. Maybe players spent resources trying to acquire that in the first place, and now the item is not as good as the economic value of the item when it was acquired. So there are all sorts of issues with overtuning an item before release. Yeah. If you're designing a live service game, which is kind of what I'm going off of for a lot of these balance ideas, because a lot of the time, those are when you have the highest stakes for overpowered and underpowered items. If there's a single player game and there's an overpowered item, that just gets in walkthroughs for that game, and otherwise becomes an interesting thing for players to discover. Wow, this sword is really good. Wow, this item does a lot for me. I should try to go out and find more of those. That doesn't break the balance of the game. But in a live service multiplayer game, you release something in a state like that, and now you've destroyed the balance of the game for all of your players until you can address that in some capacity. There's never a way to address that that pleases everybody. When you add new content to the live service game, you are certainly balancing it against the best content, because you want new content to be used. You don't want to release an expansion that says, there's this new character class, and then have that character class be absolutely abysmal to play, and no one wants to play it. Like, for instance, Diablo 4 just released a new class, and if that class is so bad that no one wants to play it, people will be coming back to the game in order to try out the new class. If that's not a good experience, you will not be able to retain those players. They will go off into the abyss and not trust you with future updates. Now, 6 months from now or 2 years from now, when you say, we're releasing a new character class, those same players won't come back to play the game because the last experience they had with that was negative. So try to balance new content so that it is used but not overpowered. And that is a very narrow window, a very narrow band of acceptability. So commonly known in the industry as power creep, because you release something new and it's supposed to be competitive with what's already out there. That creates the new standard for the power level of the game. When you release new content, you now need to have something that's competitive with that and competitive with that. And over time, the power level of your players will increase because they want to feel that sense of progression. So this will keep your players engaged, keep them buying items from each other, keep them farming for the newest things. As long as your players have a goal, something to achieve, a reason to play the game, that helps retain them, and it helps your company profit and yourself profit. Questions on thinking about cost curves from a perspective of a live service game or expansion content?
And I don't know why, like, it's just sort of thinking of like, yeah, sorry.
You're good. All right. So this is what we're already doing for our paper, but the goal here is going to be applying cost curve analysis to Harmony. So as we do this, I'm going to start querying the class, and this may spoil a little bit of your exploration into this, but I at least want to be on the same page a bit as a class as we go into this analysis to make sure that we're all thinking along the same lines. So the very first question to try to figure out is the value of heal, damage, draw, and discard, especially with proportion to each other. So let's first break down these into associated categories. So how could we break down heal, damage, draw, and discard into an interesting series of categories? Yeah,
In my mind, it feels like there's like three categories. It seems like damage and discard would be one category. Which are like directly sending things into the discard pile. Healing would be its own category and drawing would be its own category. Although I feel like there's an argument for categorizing them together as well. Just for in my opinion, I think the drawing is kind of a neutral state where
so yeah, I think we could put a boundary here. This boundary targets opponent. This boundary targets yourself. So these are your offense cards. These are your defense cards. How else could we distribute or think about this?
We could think about any things that are influencing our deck, versus that are influencing our hand.
Yeah, so we kind of have a deck versus hand, of which we have an offense and a defensive mechanic for each. What are the deck-based mechanics?
Stuff that directly affects your deck or
Your deck or your opponent's deck? Which two of those are they?
damage.
And we have excellent. Any other way to break these apart in a way that makes sense? These are the two I would hoping people would find. What's our anchor in this game?
The deck, how many cards you have left in your deck?
How many cards you have left in your deck? Is that the only way to lose the game?
Oh, and in your hand.
Yeah. So there's kind of a multi-anchor point. So you can think of this as maybe a combination. If the goal were to be how close are you to losing, that could be your anchor. So how can we define a function that is how close you are to losing? If I have 5 cards left in my hand and 5 cards left in my deck, am I equally close to losing from both of those mechanics? It depends on the balance of how much it costs to play cards that target a hand or target a deck. So depending on the balance that you come to for that, that's what's going to determine how to weight these mechanics with respect to the anchor. Since you start with 10 cards in your hand, how many cards do you start with in your deck? 42. It's 40. We have a 50-card deck, and then we start with a 10-card hand. So it'd be 40 cards left in your deck when you start the game. So from that starting point, your goal is either force your opponent to discard 10 cards or churn through 40 cards in the deck, minus any defense that your opponent does. So exactly how you look into that is going to be interesting. What are the benefits of our cards? When we're looking at a card, how do we identify its benefits?
What it does to you or your opponent.
Yeah. So it's in terms of one of these 4 things or multiple of these 4 things. Basically, if we wanted to come up with a function for this, we would say the value of damage times the amount of damage that this card does, the value of discard times the amount of value of discard, the amount of draw times the value of draw, the amount of heal times the value of heal. Sum all of those up and you get the value of the card.
What about
The
draw?
benefits.
Because draw sometimes it's not, because sometimes you don't want to draw.
So you'd have to factor that in.
draws a risky mechanic.
Draw is a bit of a risky mechanic. So there's going to be some average value to draw. Or maybe you could somehow make it conditional, but if you're trying to analyze the value of a card, you don't know the condition that that card is being played in. So how could you account for that? Would you want to look at when I play this, how frequently is when I want to play this card, how frequently is that draw a good thing? When I could play this card, how frequently is that draw a bad thing? You could attempt to account for that in your value function. You could not. This is where there's some ambiguity in how you go about finding the value for these cards, but you'll want to justify whatever it is that you do in some way that I can believe. So I'm not looking for one thing here, but I'm looking for you to explain your reasoning in a way that I can understand and that I think has a reasonable chance of leading to an adequate value function. There shouldn't be an obvious hole, like heal is, or draw is always bad, so I'm going to add it to the costs. If you asserted that and tried to back that up with some logic, I may have some questions for you. I may not believe you. But if you say there is a negative component to draw, sometimes we don't want to do this, I'm going to attempt to account for it by logic. I will critically look at that and determine the extent to which I agree with you. If I don't have an obvious counter argument, we're going to play it through and see if your value function ends up being reasonable. What other things should we consider? So benefits are just a linear combination of damage, discard, draw, and heal times the value of each of those mechanics, whatever value you come up with, and reasoning for that value. What are the costs? Yeah.
Do the power card.
We are going to say that the power cards are irrelevant to this, basically. The number of those to put in a deck is fixed since they're already in the deck at the moment. So we're kind of going to ignore them. That's a good question, though.
Even for the required number of power cards to use a healing card?
Yeah. I'm just going to say we currently have, that would be built into the cost function. So for instance, if there are 10 power cards in the deck, or 20 power cards in the deck, if I've had a card that costs 21, we would want some way of incorporating that into our cost function that says the cost of that scales so steeply at that point that this card's value is negative. In fact, it is so negative, it's so highly underpowered that we should tune it up. But that is an example of somewhere where the math reaches a break point. If there aren't enough power cards in your deck to cast that card, even if it says infinite damage, infinite discard, it's not balanced because you can't cast it. But let's talk about the cost. How could you analyze the cost of a card in Harmony?
I think you've got to first think about what its corresponding like power type would cost.
Yeah, that actually ends up being really important. So I'll pose a question to the class. Is the cost 8x equivalent to the cost 8b?
No.
A lot of people shaking their heads. Why?
So like we could go get EVs.
Yeah, in order to get 8b, you have 20 power cards in your deck, of which only 10 of them are B. You need to have this portion and exactly this portion of your power cards in your hand, or some sliding window of this on this portion. For 8x, we allow this sliding window to be anywhere along this and any combination. So it turns out there are way more ways to make 8x than there are to make 8b. The question is, what is the relative likelihood of having that on turn 8, on turn 9, on turn 10, on turn 11? What is the average time you can play this card? What is the average time that you can play this card? How about let's assume this is a bio and magic deck. Is 8b equivalent to 4b 4m? Yeah,
I think I was still waiting for it, whereas the 4v4M being more
Yep.
likely.
Yep.
Maybe.
you need to do some combinatorics to figure out exactly how, but yes, there are more ways to produce 4B4M out of randomly getting power cards in your deck than there are to produce 8B. So because of this, you're going to be able to play this card sooner on average than you can play this card. So you can't just use the total casting cost as your only measure of cost, but you will need to come up with some argument for how to weight the different costs of the different cards and have an argument that I can buy for why the costs are scaled the way that they are. And then you will take the benefits of that card, you will take the costs of that card, and you will subtract them. And that will give you a value for that card. A balanced card will be close to zero. An imbalanced card will either be underpowered if it's very negative, the costs are more than the benefits, or it'll be overpowered and the benefits are more than the costs. Which means that you can tweak each of these cards in any of these dimensions, what it does, or how much it costs, in order to try to get it to even out. Or get relatively close to evening out. The issue is you don't want to create a bunch of cards that all do the same thing. So each deck should have an identity of some kind. Right now, these decks are attempting to have an identity by picking a couple of these mechanics and focusing on a couple of those mechanics. You could make these in terms of a deck that wants to win quickly, so it has a lot of low power cards, but also when it gets to its high power cards, has lots of castable cards to make sure that they're castable on curve. It's more likely that you'll be able to cast the 8X or the 4B4M on turn 8 than the 8B. Maybe you have another deck that really wants to get to the point where it can have large swinging plays at the end of the game that'll be full of more cards that are more like the 8B, but have drastic effects that end the game instantly if and when you can cast them. So here's how we should be thinking about deck identity. Any questions on anything from this before I erase it all?
So
Yeah.
when you say that there's a deck that does more damage, or it's more like offensive,
Yeah.
does that mean it's offensive but still balanced?
Yes, it should
That's
be.
your goal, right? Okay.
Yeah. So a deck that's focusing a lot on offense shouldn't also be focusing a lot on defense. An offense versus offense deck pairing should end quickly. A game should end quickly. A game that is a deck that's defensive against a deck that's defensive should be a long, drawn-out affair. But maybe the only offense from those defensive decks happen at the very end of the game and can really swing the game very quickly. So it's a race to who can get the most relevant power out of that kind so that they can switch from being defensive and being unkillable to very offensive and knocking the opponent out in a swift action or two. Despite however much defense they might have, they can't outperform that. One other thing to note is that all things considered, what do we want more of, offense or defense? Why? Yes. The goal of this game is to eventually end. So if you pair offense and defense relatively equivalently, then your games may stagnate and take a very long time to end. So it may be worth trying to value offense as less than defense so that you can fit more offense on a card in order for it to be balanced. Have defense cost a little bit more because the purpose isn't to create an unkillable tank. The purpose would be to create an unkillable tank in the early game to force a late game to make a big swing. But the overall balance of the game should favor offense so that the game ends. Hopefully, this gets people thinking about what they want to do with regards to the game. So we looked at things like you'll want to make a cost curve for each mechanic. What is the value of every combination of these so that you can come up with the value of a card? Then you can come up with the value of a deck by summing the value of every card in that deck. You should also be thinking about, are the relationships linear? Is heel 1 10 times less valuable than heel 10? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is no. Be able to justify whatever mathematical function you apply to your heal curve, to your damage curve. In one turn, if I play a card that has damage 1, in order to get damage 10 on the field, I need to play 10 cards. If I have damage 10 in one card, I get to do that in one turn, if I have the resources to be able to cast it. It doesn't take me 10 turns to cast that card. Or maybe it does if it's the only thing in my deck, and I do nothing for the first 9 turns, and then on the 10th turn, cast something that does damage 10. But you'll need to think about, how are these relationships proportional? Value of generic power versus specific power. We talked about that with regards to a cost. So when you're costing your cards, what is the value of making something cost generic power versus specific power? So you'll want some kind of spreadsheet. Columns for each specific power type, and a general power, columns for each mechanic, columns for adding benefits and subtracting costs, and you will come up with those custom formulas to be able to determine the value of a card based on that. And you'll want to justify every decision that you make, because when perfect, mathematical analysis like this is flawed in terms of its game design. You want to get as close to perfect as you can with the decisions that you make. You don't want to just say, yeah, it's close enough to linear, I'm just going to call it linear and call it a day. Because that will lead to, when it is fully balanced, you're going to go play test it and it's going to feel bad. So 0 is on curve, negative below the curve, positive above the curve. Row for each card, its benefits and original costs, and then you can start messing with them, and you can see in real time what effects increasing the cost has on its value. You can see what happens if I change this damage 2 to damage 3. How does that affect its value? You can see that in real time. So you can answer questions like, what are the most and least powerful mechanics based on the original balance of this card game? Then you can start adjusting the costs so that each card becomes as close to on curve as we can get. So don't change the type of power, only the quantity. So don't change a bio card into a magic card or a gear card into a bio card. Mess with the quantity. You can turn things generic if you want to, or go from generic to one of the power types that are in the deck, but don't go past that. So yeah, you're going to continue this at home. The coming days, like yesterday. So yeah, as we finish up the material over the next week or so in class, we're going to be spending a little bit of time. I expect you to be going through this process starting now, and you will eventually get to a point where we can play test your new balanced decks. Yeah.
Did we already get new cards?
Yeah. If you don't have cards, you weren't here yesterday, come see me in my office. I have cards for you.
You're gonna release these slides?
Yeah.
Pretty ASAP.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If they're not out when you're looking for them, send me an email. I'll get them up as soon as I can. All right. That's that slide deck. Not too much left to cover in here. As soon as I cover this last little bit of material, we're going to be transitioning to spending some in-class time to play test. So try to get an idea of balance in your head in the next few days. I would say, but even by the end of the weekend, try to have something, try to have the value for this figured out so that you can transcribe onto the new cards that you have your best balance idea so that we can start collecting data, because that's what's going to be very valuable for you to be able to write your paper. This is not something that you can just sit down and do all in one day. It's going to be a very iterative process. You need to go through a design phase. You need to go through an analysis phase of your design. Recursively do that, loop that to the point where you are happy with your design. You think that it's ready for a playtest. Then you will transcribe your balanced cards onto the 200 cards that you were given, and we'll bring those into class to get some playtesting time. And you'll probably have to do some additional playtesting outside of class, but I want to dedicate a good bit of next week to time to get that data so that it's not just all on your own time. So that's what we're doing. In the meantime, two last things that we're going to cover. The first are thinking about games with characters and builds. So how do you design for interesting characters and builds in games? I absolutely love this. So I just had to include it so that I can read it out loud. I have a level 85 Dwarven Paladin and 82 Shadow Priest, and I'm currently leveling a warrior through Northrend, though I spend most of my time tanking instances in the Dungeon Finder. I've held off on getting Mists of Pandaria because I got burned out on endgame progression after Wrath of the Lich King, and the Cataclysm content is still new to me. Plus, monks seem redundant in an area of dual specialization and viable hybrid DPS, and while I know they're well established in the lore, Pandaren doesn't appeal to me. So I'm wrapping up a Tonka quest line in the Borean Tundra, trying to determine if I should go to Dragonblight or Grizzly Hills, and now you know how I feel when you won't shut up about sports. Perfect quote. I don't know, whenever I find humor in something like this, it's great. So know your audience, but also characters. Note that a lot of games that were released very early on in games history didn't have character creation. Is there a character creator for Pong? Is there a character creator for Space Invaders or for Pac-Man? You were just given a character and a series of levels to beat that took your skill. But tabletop RPGs came along, and game designers thought that it would be very fun to be able to play games in a different way based on how you wanted to play your character, how you wanted to engage with the content. So immediately before they even begin playing the game, you want to give the player meaningful decisions to make. How do you want to play through this game? What character would you like to take the role of? So from a character selector, you can either allow the player to choose between pre-generated characters. This is true in genres like fighters, MOBAs, racers, RPGs that have a quick start option. Attributes, useful to customize so that you can start to prioritize how is it that you want to beat the game? How is it, what do you want to be strong at? What are you okay being weak at? Of course, you can have multiple classes, full player customization, purchasing attributes with a pool of points or attribute currency on the creation screen. All of these create very interesting decisions. But a lot of the time, there's kind of a lack of transparency between what these stats do in the game and the decisions that you're making early on. So clarity when you're asking someone to make an important decision before even engaging with the content is important. They should know or have enough information to make an informed decision during the creation process, even if they're a new player. Something else that's come to light, primary and secondary attributes. You can ask questions like, is this stat best for all characters or just a particular character class? Should I spread my points around or just focus on a couple attributes? I find that not a lot of character creators give you a good sense of what's going to work well or not work well with regards to that. So some players will find themselves going and looking up guides before even playing the game at all to make sure that they're not messing up with regards to their character creator. So it's worth, in my perspective, as a designer, either design for regardless of whatever the player can do at that starting position, make it viable to continue from that point. If a player would do very poorly in the game, if they had less than 4 of a particular attribute, hard code and force there to be at least 4 of every attribute, and then let the player choose beyond that where they would like to allocate the rest of their initial attribute points. They should be able to make up for any deficiencies in the decisions that they make from the character creator with the decisions that they make through the rest of their gameplay. Yeah.
I also like the sort of trope where early in the game you get the opportunity to like for one chance to change your stats.
Yeah, respec in some capacity. You make these decisions, you play the game, you're unhappy with your decisions, you can change your mind without having to restart the game from scratch. It's nice on the character creation screen, if that is going to be the case, that you tell the player, you will have a respec opportunity. This decision is not permanent. Or this game has been designed such that every combination that you could pick here will work or works for a particular play style. And that can help nervous players like me make sure that they're not completely creating a character that is not going to work just because of their naivety with regards to the game systems.
I don't know about you, but I fall into this, especially with RPGs, this feeling that I need to like min-max from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
When in reality, you should play the game first and then min-max after.
Right. Play it a couple times where you explore, and then with the knowledge you gain from that, then you go back and have an optimized run.
And you don't want to make a search of a guide or optimal build stats before you get into the game.
The issue with that is it almost feels like if the game is designed for you to be optimizing or min-maxing, then the game is going to be more difficult than it's intended if you're making those kinds of mistakes. So players who want to, they need more information from the start. So maybe including more information about what each stat does, some potential pre-allocated. If you don't know what to do, here are some developer pre-allocated character builds that we have proven to be successful with the game. Something that allows you to get a sense of, here is one direction you can go, keep going in that direction and you'll be fine. The other issue with that is if people are going and looking up builds for the absolute min-maxed ideas, then maybe the game plays too easy and you get a reputation for having designed an easy game. And that's just because everyone's sharing the best strategies. Skills. Many games have active and passive skills. You may be able to choose initial skills during your character creation. Design questions that you might ask, are all skills available from the beginning of the game? Are they unlocked as the player levels, as they complete quests, as they engage with the content in the game in some capacity? Why might you design a game one way or the other there? Are there reasons why you might want to have all skills available from the very beginning of the game? Are there reasons you might want to hide skills behind player levels or other game content? What are people's thoughts on that?
I understand a lot, personally.
Unlocked for what benefits?
Especially if you're doing like a role playing game, it's like that definitely adds to the role play. It's like I'm becoming a more powerful mage because now I'm intelligent enough or experienced enough to finally use the spell.
Yeah, it can be very immersive. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and kind of on that note, it kind of depends on the story of the game.
Also, too, you could do design new game spaces. So it's like as you level up, it's like it makes sense to have these more powerful spells, and that gives you new dynamics. So it's like now you can kind of quarantine like new kinds of gameplay that keeps your game interesting.
Yeah.
Where otherwise, if it's available all at the beginning, it's like, well, I'm just going to go for the best stuff. Like I'll just sit there.
If you know what that is, otherwise it could create decision paralysis. So
Yeah.
There are hundreds of skills. What do I choose?
That's
Why? What's better and what's worse? If you have a very limited set in the beginning, then
You get to learn what's bad.
you can learn what's good and what's bad without having to completely restart. Yeah.
Can't remember exactly if it is totally, if there are certain skills that are blocked. When I first played Batman Arkham City, I felt like there was so many options right out the gate. And you could unlock things that like from low down on the tree. I think it was organized more like columns, but in my mind, all that did was it was like, oh, choose the stuff at the bottom of the tree because it's the best stuff. It was like these are all just different tools in your tool belt. You know, you can shoot electricity from your hand instead of instead of having to always beat the guys up.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, it's a way of keeping the game fresh. If you unlock it as you, it gives players goals, things to farm toward. There's this really cool skill I want to try out, but I can't try it out until if you're aware that that skill is something that can be unlocked.
no, but I'm pretty sure in Arkham you could unlock it right
Yeah.
away, just because it did its own, it did a completely unique thing. It wasn't
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that give you, if you're the player and you determine, I really want to shoot lightning out of my hands, if you can start the game with that, how long can you go along with that until you are bored with that and you want to try out something else? Or if that's the only thing that really appealed to you, does that create retention issues long term? I have no idea. I'm throwing out reasons why you might design for one versus the other. If all the skills are available from the beginning, then maybe there's something that you're communicating to the player, these skills are all balanced. It's not like you're going to be unlocking more and more and more powerful skills. Maybe if it's a more PvP kind of game, allow players to choose from any skill at the beginning that says the ones that are unlocked later aren't more powerful. Everything's available from the beginning. So there's a delicate balance there between overwhelming the player during their creation and also streamlining the start of the game as well. So skill trees allow you to unlock skills via advanced criteria and completing quests, whatever else, acquiring resources and spending resources to unlock skills. This would be like the science, using science as a way to unlock tech and progress on the tech tree in a 4X game. Equipment is the starting equipment for a character customizable or selectable. Are you given a particular weapon, or are you allowed to pick and choose between a set of starting weapons? For classes, to what extent do you want that class selection to determine the game's options? Do you just want to start with a character and have people determine more about their class specialization as they play the game? Or do you want to lock the player into that selection before they even start the game? This makes me think of something like Titan Quest's evolution, where you begin the game, there is no character selector except a little bit of what you look like. At level 2, you pick a class specialization, which unlocks a series of skill trees. And then at level 8, you unlock a second one. So you can start to pair, you can create pairs of those trees. And now you have a lot more options at your disposal. But as you play the game, you unlock the ability to specialize from there. The character creation is spread over the first act of the game. What kinds of skill options do we have? Are there limitations on stats for those skills? So can you only cast this spell if you have at least 40 intelligence? Can you only wield this sword or do this slam if you have at least 40 strength? You can either have more gentle or more forceful pushes toward the direction of what the class is supposed to do or the class is supposed to be good at. Maybe you want the player to completely be able to choose. I know I said mage on the character creator, but I'm going to build this spell slinging, hammer wielding, shirtless mage that is capable of casting some spells and also knocking off some heads with my hammer in ways that maybe the designers didn't intend. They were thinking you should pick one or the other, but you allow the player to really play the game or role play the game the way that they want to. To what extent do you want to allow the player to do that? And to what extent do you want to guide the player and saying, it would be really good, we designed this game for you to pick this or that, not try to do this in the middle. If you allow the player to do it in the middle, you should balance for that. You should anticipate there are some players who are going to be doing that, either make it viable or have some way in the game that tells you that that's a bad idea.
that's why I think the Oblivion's class system's kind of cool, because it's like you have like the 3 things that you can give, like the wizard, the fighter, and the rogue.
Yeah.
And then every other class is like the cross section between each one of them in different amounts.
Yeah.
1/3 rogue, 2/3 fighter. That's what it is.
Yeah, Path of Exile does the same thing. Yeah, lots of games kind of go that route where it's a spectrum. And you can pick different hybrid specializations based on that.
Spectrum.
We can talk about different build levels of viability. So think about viability as the sum of all of the choices the player makes, both during character creation and throughout any in-game choices that they have available to them. And this series of choices affects your character stats, affects the skills that your character has available. So this defines their build. A build will be viable. There are different levels of viability. There's optimal, which means mathematically we have analyzed every possibility that could be done and mapped that to some mathematical function. And this is the set of choices that maximizes via some reward criteria or viability criteria. Here are the choices that lead to the best results. But oftentimes you need to reverse engineer that system to be able to figure out how good is everything? What exactly does every stat do? What does sometimes there's a little bit of hidden information in games about that. So you need to reverse engineer the system to be able to mathematically determine what is best. Yeah.
If you're spending 10 minutes, 20 minutes on your level up, you do too much. They want you to just quit.
Yeah. I'm the 10 to 20.
No, me too, every time.
Yeah. So rest of them, we'll go back over this tomorrow, but there's viable, marginally viable, non-viable. So there are different levels of viability. Viable, capable of completing the game on the default difficulty controlled by a typical player. Marginally viable, suboptimal characters that can beat the game as long as you have a skilled player piloting that character. Non-viable cannot complete the game with that build. We'll come back tomorrow and talk more about it. Start thinking about harmony balance.
We're good.